6 weeks after New Yorkers voted in primaries and initial results just came out for New York's 12th congressional race.
How we were so ill-equipped to handle the massive influx of these and how thousands of people never got their ballots.
Suraj Patel is trailing incumbent Congresswoman Carolyn Maloney by a few thousand votes. Maloney declined our interview request, but sent a statement thanking supporters. Patel is suing to reinstate ballots that he says were unfairly rejected. About 20% of mail-in ballots were deemed invalid, a staggering number when you consider the percent of invalid ballots in most U.S. elections, based on the fairly limited data that we have, is thought to be about 1.5%.
Literally in my race, 12,500 people out of 105,000 are never going to have their voices heard. That's a shame for democracy.
Once election workers received the ballots, they had to route them to the right place to get counted. Then instead of immediately scanning the ballots into machines, workers needed to pore over every detail to figure out if the ballots would be considered valid. The reasons for invalidating a ballot vary. The signature doesn't match the registration, the ballot or the mailing envelope lacks a signature, the ballot has a stray mark on it or a note attached to it, the ballot arrives late and doesn't have a postmark by Election Day. Matt Sanderson is an attorney specializing in elections and campaign finance.
That voters could cast a ballot and do everything right, but at the end of the day not have their vote counted because of a technicality like a mismatched signature. So that I think is very much a cautionary tale.
While those technicalities are legal, Patel worries they're unfair. The issue of the postmark and arrival is at the center of his lawsuit. Some post offices did not postmark the prepaid envelopes provided to voters by the state. Patel says some ballots arrived on June 24th, a day after the Election Day due date. He has affidavits from voters who say they did not receive their mail-in ballots until Election Day, and others who didn't receive them at all.
And we are a textbook example in New York of how not to run an election by mail. And we only have a few months left before November. This could be a canary in the coal mine.
Mail-in votes are expected to play a significant role in the 2020 election because of the coronavirus pandemic. Despite little historical evidence of fraud, President Trump has repeatedly claimed mail-in voting will increase it.
Mail-in ballots are very dangerous. Mail-in ballots, people can forge them. Foreign countries can print them. Mail-in voting is going to rig the election. I really do.
Are you suggesting that you might not accept the results of the election?
I have to see.
And he's using the situation in New York to bolster his claim, incorrectly tweeting that state ballots are missing. This year, many congressional and down-ballot seats are up for grabs, and swing states like Wisconsin have also rejected a large number of mail-in ballots in primaries, arguably making the stakes even higher in November.
It absolutely has to be the case that election officials draw some lessons both in New York and across the country.
The long lines during primaries across the country, combined with trouble in New York's 12th congressional district, has some like Sanderson wondering if 2020 could be an extended repeat of 2000 and turn Election Day into an election month or more.
So what you could see this type of very contentious post-Election Day period play out not only with the presidency, which is obviously the most significant, but also other down-ballot races that are, at the end of the day, just as important as the presidency.
Different states have different rules when it comes to mail-in ballots and deadlines. One of the most important things for voters to do, especially right now, is make sure they're educated on the voting process and the rules in their states. The more you know, the less likely you are to make some sort of mistake that could lead to your ballot being rejected or marked invalid.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.